So if you didn't know, my name is Kavi and I've been living in China for 6 years. And so on my channel, I share a lot of information and experience with you about, what is my experience living in China, learning Chinese, and interacting with modern Chinese culture. And so the topic of today's video was actually inspired by a comment that was left on one of my last videos, which engages with, have I ever experienced racism while living in China? And so I wanted to explain this concept in 4 parts and kind of give you a general outline, a general understanding of the kind of racism that you might experience while living in China, and what is the overall general sense of people living in China. Do they care about racism? Is that something that most people experience in China? So let's get started. So the first topic that I want to discuss is racism from the general public perspective. What is the reaction of the general public when they see a foreigner? They see somebody that's different. What do they think? How do they act? Are they racist, technically? And to tell you the truth, I would say it's more about ignorance than it is just straight up about racism. To put it in perspective, a majority of Chinese people have never seen a foreigner in their life, in person. A majority. Of course, maybe they've seen them on TVs or in the movies. But if you talk about, coming to China, living in China, in their daily experience, they have never actually maybe met a foreigner, somebody from a different country, or interacted with that person. I'm talking about a very normal, basic Chinese person. And that has a lot to do with, not a lot of foreigners being in China, overall. So, of course, we could talk about cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, where in some cases, foreigners have become abundant, and you see the influence of foreigners everywhere in restaurants, going out to bars and nightclubs. You can find foreigners in these cities. But even in a new first-tier city, like the city I live in, Chengdu, it's not so often that you will find foreigners. So from living in Chengdu, from this perspective, I could tell you that most Chinese people have never fully met or encountered a foreigner. And so that's why they're still surprised when they see foreigners on the street. That's why they still ask foreigners to take pictures with them. And they're, more than anything, their racism is fueled by curiosity. They are just curious about who you are, what you do, where you come from. All the information that they have about you probably comes from the internet. It comes from a different source. Maybe somebody telling them certain people are this way, Americans are like this, Indian people are like that, African people are like this. But to be honest, they have never actually, met somebody from these places, a majority of Chinese people. So it comes from curiosity. They are curious about who you are. They want to know about who you are, what you do. And potentially, they will say some things to you that was told to them by social media, online news, or by a friend. And so that is, generally speaking, how the public will treat foreigners overall. And so it doesn't come from a place that's racist or trying to be racist. It comes from a place of curiosity, of them just staring at you, wanting to see something different. It's like seeing a unicorn on the street. It's not really them trying to pick you out because you're different. It's because you're different, so I want to learn more about why you're different. So, from a dating perspective, do Chinese women especially just want white men? Is white more favorable than, other cultures and people from other places? And generally speaking, I would have to say yes, it is, just from my own experience. And that is because a lot of the culture, a lot of the, media that they have consumed, I'm talking about the newest generation of Chinese people, has been developed from, American films, American TV shows mostly. And so they have this idea of, what white people are, why they look so handsome. White and black in China are very distinct when it comes to a cultural perspective. Like in China, what is white usually means what is good. And what is black means, something that's not as good, or maybe something that's tarnished, something that is not wholesome. So there are these connotations within the Chinese culture, the Chinese language, and you can't really separate that from how people think and how people, feel. They have these connotations in the language, so it is a part of how they think. And just based on that basis and treating white people versus treating other kinds of people, it is just generally a natural inclination, a generalization to say they treat white people better. Potentially, Chinese women want to date white men because, they have these kinds of characteristics. And, but I would say that's most of Asia at the same time. And I think it really comes down to, the media, American culture, and what they've seen on TV in movies from Netflix that, give them this perspective more than anything else. They'll say that, French people are like this, English people are like that, American people are like this, they're so handsome, So more than a race thing, I think it's more of a perspective thing. I think it's also something that's somewhat ingrained in the cultural values of Chinese as well. But of course, everyone is different, I've met Chinese people who have married other cultures, people from other cultures, and it's because they like that culture, It's because they've fallen in love with that culture for some reason, or that person because of who they are, So of course it's possible for Chinese people, Chinese women to fall in love with a person of any kind of culture, but it's just these implicit biases based on, what they have seen. So the third part I want to talk about is online. And of course, online prejudice, online racism is the worst. And so I just want to tell you a little bit of why that is, On Xiaohongshu, on RedNote, I've seen some of the most racist posts, especially on the posts of black people and darker skinned people, just because, of who is the poster, In China, there is a billion people. Okay, there are so many people in China. So of course some of these people are going to be online trolls. And a majority of them are going to be disheartened men who feel like, they have to prove something through their opinions and through being vulgar online. And this is no different from any other country, but in China, the way that the language is and the way they speak so directly, there's some really horrible stuff on Chinese social media. And Have I experienced it personally? No, not really. But does it exist? Yes. And, like, you will see like stickers and comments all about this, and it's really, really vulgar stuff. It's really bad stuff. But you have to keep in mind who is the poster. You know, why would they be posting this? It's probably because something in their life is not, going right for them. Probably because they are uneducated, or probably because, they see foreigners as a threat to their country. But of course, this is a certain population, and on the whole, Chinese people can also be very accepting. This is the thing about China. Like, you could have a very uneducated person from a village, spewing hate, but at the same time, you could have a very, wealthy and a sophisticated person who has studied abroad and knows better, and they can both be Chinese. And so this dichotomy exists online, but overall, the haters, the trolls will say some horrible things online. But in the end, it's up to you. It's up to you what you let into your heart, what you take to your heart from others. It's not about, what they've said. It's about how you've taken it. And so that's pretty much my opinion on the racism I've seen online. And so the last thing that I want to discuss with you is what is my personal experience with racism in China? What have I personally seen or experienced from others? And to be honest with you, it's really not too bad. It's really not a lot. So first of all, you should know that my ethnicity is Sri Lankan, but I'm an American citizen, so I consider myself a Sri Lankan American. And so anytime a Chinese person sees me, a taxi driver, somebody on the street, they'll immediately ask me, are you Indian or Pakistani? And am I offended by that? No, not really, because, my heritage comes from South Asia. They're not that far off. But in some instances, I've had random strangers call me African. They honestly think I'm African. And at that point, I think, they're definitely a little bit off. They should, maybe they should study up a little more on, geography. But when they ask me if I'm Indian or Pakistani, I'm not offended that they don't think I'm American. Like, never once has anyone come up to me and been like, oh, you're American, right? But in America, it's like that's the thing most people protect. They want people to realize that they're American. They're not Chinese or something else, But for me, living here for 6 years, it's not a problem. It's not a problem for me to be mislabeled, It's not a problem for me to, after telling them I'm not Indian or Pakistani and telling them that I'm American, them giving me questionable looks, them refuting the fact that I'm not American or something like that. I don't take that seriously either, because I know who I am. Like, that's the point of how you should even take this racism or whatever it is, this ignorance. I wouldn't even call it racism. I just call it ignorance, because these people don't know better. They've never even met somebody that's not Chinese in some cases, And so, have I been in really racist situations either? With people or authorities or anything like that? No. In some ways, I think China is even less racist than America, because in China, to be honest, they do not treat people differently based on where you're from. Like, on the street, yeah, maybe people personally would treat you differently, but like things like, buying stuff or, where you can go, what you can do. A foreigner could do anything that a Chinese person can do, pretty much. A foreigner could buy anything at the same price as a Chinese person. And I think that is very telling, you know. If you as a foreigner can buy something at the same price as a Chinese person, you know, that's respect, you know. That shows you that, you know, maybe they want you to be here. And of course, Chinese people are very welcoming. They're known for being welcoming, being humble, being able to do the same things as any other Chinese person, you know, being accepted, being welcomed for the most part, has always been a part of my experience living in China. Of course, I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel that way. And I've lived here for 6 years, so to tell you the truth, my experience with racism, you know, ignorance, has just been something that I personally have had to accept, I have had to understand, and I have had to be responsible for my own reactions and how I take these comments. And so I really think it's an interesting topic. It's not a topic that I usually discuss with people, you know, because I have better things to think about. But if you like my honesty, if you like the information that I'm giving you about modern China from my own perspective, then subscribe to the channel. You know, leave a comment about what you think. Were you surprised about my take? You know, about what my experience was? And like the video, and I will see you in the next video.